Hello everyone. Today I'm going to address the actual plan for today would be to look at the fascist origins of totalitarianism, and we will see that um, uh, the word emerged soon after the coming to power of Benito Mussolini, who is often identified as the first totalitarian leader. And then we will see that almost immediately thereafter, the liberal thinkers, the liberal economists and philosophers developed a critical perspective on totalitarian tendencies that they could observe in the 1920s and the 1930s in a number of European countries. And then we will see how totalitarianism was further developed as a notion, as a concept, as a theory in both philosophy and the political science in the post-World War II decades. And so I begin with the fascist origins, so to say, of the term of totalitarianism, and we um, should realize that although for us the word totalitarian or the word totalitarianism carries an unmistakably negative connotation, it did not always have this negative connotation. In fact, almost immediately after the word, the term was coined, it was actually appropriated by the totalitarian politicians and used by them as a kind of positive designation of what they were doing, what they were trying to do. We have to understand that the early 1920s, and in fact the entire interwar period, was the time when at the beginning, the liberal parliamentary regime became pretty much the norm of much of Europe in the wake of the First World War, but almost immediately this type of regime revealed its limitations, and these limitations became the object of criticism on the part of all sorts of right-wing politicians and intellectuals who decried the chaotic state of many European governments, many parliamentary governments. You probably know, or perhaps you know from the political science, for example, that parliamentary regimes are often characterized by rather short-lived and unstable governments because they are often the product of parliamentary coalitions that are rarely stable and rarely enduring. So this was definitely true of the 1920s in quite a few European countries, and the right-wing authoritarian politicians and intellectuals decried this decadent tendency in political life, this chaotic tendency in the political life that manifested itself in the wake of the First World War. The term totalitarian was coined by an Italian journalist, Giovanni Amendola, who used it to designate the changes in the political system of Italy that were introduced by Benito Mussolini almost immediately after he was named the Prime Minister of Italy by the Italian king. And these changes, specifically in the electoral system, were introduced by Mussolini in order to assure a kind of permanent political monopoly for his fascist party. For this reason, both Benito Mussolini and his supporters almost immediately assumed this term and used it to designate the essence of the transformation that they were trying to carry out, both in Italian politics but also in the broader Italian society. The goal of which was to subordinate all aspects of social and cultural and individual life to the state, the state, which they took as the expression of the national will and the national interest. But not long thereafter, we see that the phenomenon of totalitarianism was increasingly addressed and critically addressed by the liberal thinkers of the interwar period, who almost immediately identified totalitarianism as a kind of anti-liberalism. And when I use the word liberalism or liberal, I use it not in the contemporary US meaning of the term, where it basically serves as a substitute for the word socialism, right? I use the word liberalism and the word liberal in the 19th century European sense of the term, when liberals were essentially those people who conceptualized society as a market and who sought to reduce the role of the state to that of the simple guardian of the property rights, which would not have any active involvement, any active role in the economic life of the nation. So the interwar liberal thinkers tried to defend this approach to economy and politics at the time when these classical liberal 19th century principles were challenged by both extreme right movements and leaders and regimes, as well as extreme left movements, leaders and regimes. So for these defenders of liberalism, totalitarianism was associated with central planning, that is, the prominent role of the state in economy, and a kind of holistic thinking in both economy and other domains, which they try to criticize and which they believe to be highly harmful and dangerous. So one of the first interwar thinkers to address the totalitarian tendencies in the economic domain specifically was the representative of the so-called Austrian School of Economics, Ludwig von Mises, who eventually emerged as an important representative of the neoliberal philosophy later on in the course of the 20th century. So already in the 1920s, at the time when the Soviet government was implementing the centrally planned and state-owned economy, Ludwig von Mises attacked, so to say, this approach and argued that it would not work as an alternative, so to say, to free market, because the central planner never has all the information which is needed in order to assure the most optimal allocation of limited resources. According to von Mises, as well as other representatives of economic liberalism and neoliberalism, the individual entrepreneur, individual businessman, will always be better informed than any sort of central planning agency in terms of what would be the best local use of local limited resources. And so for this reason, the centrally planned and state-owned economy would always be less efficient, so to say, than the market economy, at least as far as Ludwig von Mises and his associates believed. This approach, or this line of critique of totalitarian approach in economic policy, was developed further by another representative of this Austrian School of Economics and another representative of neoliberalism, Friedrich von Hayek, whose most famous book is called The Road to Freedom. And in it, he criticized the reduction of entrepreneurial freedom through central planning, which, according to him, inevitably led to the loss of personal and political freedom and ultimately to totalitarianism. And von Hayek was concerned not just by what the Soviets were doing, so to say, in economy, but by what the Western governments were increasingly doing in the course of the 1930s and the 1940s, because at the time of the Great Depression and in its aftermath, the general approach was towards the greater role of the state in economy, greater role of central planning. In other words, there was a notable and noticeable deviation from those classical liberal 19th century principles of free market and non-interference of state in economy. And then at a still greater level, this liberal critique of totalitarianism continued in the post-World War II period, at the time of the Cold War. And of course, here we have to mention the name of Hannah Arendt, who published perhaps her most important work called The Origins of Totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, who was initially a German philosopher, but who emigrated from Germany to the United States and spent most of her life and became famous as a philosopher already after the Second World War. So in this famous book of 1951, she proposes an entire philosophical theory of totalitarianism, and she argues that it represents a novel form of government that differs from earlier forms of oppression, such as tyranny and dictatorship, by the way in which it uses terror. So while terror is not modern, while terror was used by the classical and medieval and early modern tyrants and dictators, only in totalitarian regimes do we have the use of terror not just to destroy the political opposition, but to actually continuously exercise continued control over the mass of the individuals, over the mass of the subjects of a totalitarian regimes, of the totalitarian regime. According to Arendt, it was the First World War and the economic crisis of the 1930s that created the preconditions for the emergence of this novel type of oppression. She argues that it was the disintegration of the pre-World War I system of social classes and social groups that produces the phenomenon of the masses. So the erstwhile social classes turn into masses who no longer recognize themselves in the classical political parties that existed since the 19th century, such as the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, the Socialist or Social Democratic Party. So instead of these political parties and their supporters, who are often members of a specific social group or social class, we have the mass of atomized individuals who feel isolated and who feel disoriented and who seek to overcome this isolation and this disorientation by identifying themselves with a totalitarian leader and with a certain ideology that this leader articulates, usually as simplistic or simplified or simplifying ideology, such as racism, for example. And so it is precisely these developments that explain the rise of totalitarianism in a number of European countries in the interwar. This liberal approach to totalitarianism was continued by the political scientists in the post-World War II decades, and it was the two political scientists, Karl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, who gave totalitarianism a classic definition in their work, Totalitarianism. Let me then conclude by saying a couple of words about the differences between totalitarianism on the one hand and such traditional traditional forms of oppression as tyranny and dictatorship. So while, as I said, there is a tendency to use the while there is a tendency to use the word totalitarianism as a synonym of tyranny and to call totalitarian leaders modern-day tyrants, I have to say that there is a very significant difference between classical tyranny as it existed, for example, in ancient Greece and 20th century totalitarian regimes. So in a tyranny, the ruler seeks to destroy the opposition and to monopolize power, right? And the ruler uses terror to that purpose. But once the opponents are gone or are destroyed, there is no attempt to actually mobilize the masses, right? In a classical or medieval or early modern tyranny, the masses remain demobilized. We are still in the age before the advent of mass politics. Which means that the mass of the population is not involved in politics, is not taking part in the political conflict. In totalitarianism, by contrast, the totalitarian regime itself is the product of the mobilization of the masses. So totalitarian regimes can only take place once we enter the age of mass politics, once the masses began to participate in politics. That is, we basically have no totalitarian regime before the introduction of the mass voting rights, right? Nowhere do we have a totalitarian regime prior to the introduction of universal vote. And so the masses are already part of politics. They already take part in politics, and actively so. And the leader, totalitarian leader, is usually the someone who expresses the will of the masses, or so he claims to be. But in any case, the masses have an important role in the legitimization of a totalitarian. And one final slide on the correlation between totalitarianism on the one hand and tyranny as well as dictatorship on the other. So when we think about tyranny and dictatorship, these are two forms of oppressive kind of authoritarian or illiberal rule that were there since the times of classical antiquity. So both have the connotation of a kind of arbitrary rule by a single individual who monopolizes all power. The difference between dictatorship and tyranny is that tyranny often has the psychological connotation. So when we think about an ancient tyrant, perhaps the first person that comes to mind would be the Roman Emperor Nero, who was probably a mentally unstable person, right? And then when we think, and so tyranny has this psychological connotation, the connotation of a psychological disorder, whereas dictatorship and dictator has a military connotation, right? And so when we think about a classical dictator, well, the name of Julius Caesar comes most readily to mind, I guess. Right? Now, it's interesting to look at the original meaning of both tyranny and dictatorship, because it was different from what we have nowadays, right? So who are the first Greek tyrants? Well, these are usually the representatives of aristocracy who turn against their own class and become self-proclaimed champions of the people. So they are part of that political conflict in the Greek polis that in the course of which the role of aristocracy declines, among other things due to the advent of the tyrants. And of course, when you think of Greek tyrants, ancient Greek tyrants in contemporary terms, the word populist politician most often, most readily comes to mind, because what was essentially a Greek tyrant? Well, it was what in present is the populist politician. And then, as far as Roman dictators are concerned, I mean, when we think about dictatorship, first of all, we have this negative connotation that this term carries for us, right? But it did not have a negative connotation in either classical times or medieval times or early modern times or even for much of the 19th century. The dictators were not necessarily those who were at odds with the republican regime, because in ancient Rome, a dictator was actually an official who was endowed with the extraordinary powers for a short period of time to deal with a national emergency, such as a major invasion, for example, or someone who was given extraordinary power to bring the city-state out of a political deadlock, right? And so